Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're going to have probably about a 20-minute presentation here, and then we'll get back to the mingling. But in the meantime, we're going to kick this evening off.
All right. Well, with that introduction, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mayor Matt Miller. Welcome, everybody. And I do have a couple of notes written down. But again, welcome. I'm glad to see everybody here. So good evening and welcome to our second open house for the comprehensive plan update. So it's great to see so many familiar faces and some new ones as well. Thank you for taking the time to come here so we can work this important process together. So as we dive into tonight's session, I want to emphasize how crucial your input is in shaping the future of our community. The comprehensive plan isn't just a set of policies, it's our shared vision for Anacortes over the next 20 years. This is your opportunity to ask questions, provide feedback, and help us refine the direction we're headed. So tonight you'll hear updates on where we are in the process, including some developments in the climate element, and we'll also touch on the other components of the plan. Afterwards, there'll be time to explore the details at the open house stations where you can engage directly with our team and consultants. And again, as always, planacortes.org. You can always get info there. So with that, I'd like to hand it over back to John or Katie, I think John, to walk us through the next steps. Again, thank you all for being here and appreciate your time. Thank you.
Good evening and thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is John Coleman. I'm the Director of Planning, Community, and Economic Development. I'm just going to give a brief update about where we are with our comprehensive plan and update. It's not. And explain the process that we're going to go through, not just today, but where we are with the comp plan update. And we're having a technology problem already. Hey, Mitchell. We can't advance the slides. Are we coming from a different computer? So, well, he works his magic. So our comp plan update we're doing in two phases. So first, we've already started with the comp plan itself. In the comprehensive plan, we have goals and policies. So each element of the comprehensive plan, and you see several of those around here: land use and housing, and economic development, transportation, and so it starts with our goals and policies. So back up a step here. What is the comprehensive plan? It's, as you see here, it's primary policy document that guides our city's planning over a 20-year period. So we look at our projected population and employment growth, and we plan for the next 20 years how we're going to accommodate that growth. We also do a lot more. We reach out to the community every 10 years during our update process, our periodic update every 10 years. And we really engage with the community in a holistic way, trying to make sure that we've got correct feedback from the community about the city grow over the next 20 years. And we envelop that into our comprehensive plan. And this just shows, so our comprehensive plan guides our development regulations, our other plans, such as our housing action plan and other programs, and down to more fine detailed documents that the city provides. But the comprehensive plan is the overall guiding document. So as I was saying, we're doing our updates in two phases. First, we're starting with updating the goals and policies of each of the elements. Those go to the Planning Commission for public review. We've been taking one element at a time. We've so far done land use and housing. We've brought our transportation goals and policies. We're going to be bringing our economic development goals to the Planning Commission here shortly. And we'll be having public hearings, or have had public hearings we're going to then take all of that information once we get through all of the elements and refine it into the overall comprehensive plan elements. And we will bring all of that back to the public after we've had a chance to receive your input. The input is ongoing, so we're still taking input on everything. No decisions have been made. We're just taking it in bite-sized pieces. Along the way, we're also reviewing our housing action plan that the city council adopted in 2023. So we're trying to take several of the recommendations in those and take those and move them into our development regulations, make adjustments. But first, those are going through the public review process. We've already had a couple of public meetings where those have been presented. That's all available on our planning commission page, and that work is ongoing. We're also working on our land use map amendments. We've had an urban growth area expansion, so we're going to be having a presentation in the next couple of weeks from the group that requested that, and then public hearings on it. And then there's also several zoning changes that we're going to be reviewing over the next month or so. Once we hit Thanksgiving, we're going to take a little break on our planning commission because nobody wants to come to a planning commission meeting and try to go through a great big policy thing while getting ready for Thanksgiving dinner and other holidays. And then we'll resume in the new year. We'll continue with more goals and policies of more elements, and then move into our development regulations in the spring and summer. Like I said, those are all going to be going through the public review process. Here's a little slightly out of date chart of how we're doing this process. Hopefully it all makes sense to you. This is all available in tonight's meeting materials that'll be on our website. As I mentioned, these are the elements that we've already worked on. What I didn't mention is we've already started a lot of work on the climate change element. We have assembled a climate team that is a group of people selected from the community that represent certain interests that are going to be affected by goals, both climate change and the goals and policies that we put in place. And so those are our local citizens that are working on this, and many of them are here today. So thank you to all the climate team members for being on the team, first of all, and second of all, for showing up at yet another meeting. And then in the new year, we'll talk about parks and recreation, utilities, capital facilities, and our environment and conservation elements. So with that, I started to mention our climate element. And so I'm going to pass it off to Katie Saunders, who's one of our consultants working for Makers Architecture. And she's going to tell you all about our climate element.
Good evening. It's lovely to be back with you again tonight. For those that attended the open house back in June, this is a bit of a recap, but I wanted to make sure anyone that is new tonight has all the background. So what is the climate element? This is a new requirement for climate planning as part of the comprehensive plan process. So it's a new element that's being added in this update cycle. For the city of Anacortes, this includes two sections: a greenhouse gas emissions reduction sub-element, which is a bit of planner language, but it's a section of the element, and also a resilience sub-element. So how can we help the city of Anacortes plan for the impacts of climate change? The part of this climate element, another requirement, is to advance environmental justice and to avoid environmental health disparities. So that's embedded in both of the sub-elements work to address those and to make sure we're not exacerbating impacts on overburdened populations. The text on the right of the slide here sort of provides some of the background text from the bill. John already mentioned the climate team. We had a first meeting with the group in September. The names here are listed. Thank you all. Many of you are here tonight. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to have on the ground discussions directly with community members to really understand the diverse ways in which folks are impacted and making sure that we're coming together with solutions that are going to really advance for all in the community. And we'll be working with the climate team for meetings throughout the process. We have one coming up in November. Those meetings, I believe November 19th, those meetings are open for they're recorded and available online, and also open for the public to sit in and attend. This process diagram provides an overview of kind of the overall process for the climate element, as well as kind of how it folds into the comprehensive plan. So we've wrapped up the data gathering phase, and we're sort of in the midst of the analysis assessment. We're sharing tonight with you sort of draft or working draft information from that we're also going to want to talk to the climate team to make sure we're really fully understanding that. And then we're going to shift quickly or efficiently this fall, starting at our next meeting, into sort of talking about goals and policies with that climate team group, and work on that over the next several meetings with that group. The end result is not only a climate element that folds into the comprehensive plan, but a real integration. As those of you who understand or are familiar with climate, it touches a lot of different areas. And so one of the approaches that we're taking is how we can really integrate the goals and policies that align with transportation, that aligns with parks, that aligns with utilities, those elements really well, so that there aren't competing aspects of the document at the end of the process. So what are these local impacts? I'm giving a brief presentation tonight and also sharing some tools that we've developed as a team to help kind of share the information broadly with the Anacortes community. So we're just going to work through this slide pretty quickly. It may be a little frustrating to get through all the information, or I know I'm not getting into details, but we have lots more information on the boards tonight and are here all until 8 to talk and answer more questions. So I'm going to run through this pretty quickly, but here tonight to talk in more detail. This slide provides an overview of the key ways that climate change is already impacting or is projected to impact Anacortes in the future, and really focusing in on what are the impacts that are most relevant to Anacortes. So of the elements, SLR means sea level rise. I should have written that out on the slide, but sea level rise combined with coastal flooding. Anacortes isn't as vulnerable as some other local communities, maybe to sea level rise specifically, but when it comes to coastal flooding, there are lots of factors that come into play, from wave action, storm surge, precipitation. All these things can influence the level of coastal flooding. And we know there have been some recent influences or impacts from coastal flooding. So that's something that the team is really looking at and understanding. How is coastal flooding currently impacting assets in Anacortes, and how is that projected to worsen in the future or change in the future? Precipitation and the change in precipitation is also predicted to change, but this is in some different ways. There's a slight increase in overall precipitation, but also less rain in the summer. So it can lead to really diverse impacts, from drought stress, storms and flooding and the intensity of that, and then some potential for increase in erosion and landslide, which was a result of some of those heavy rains and changes in precipitation. For erosion and landslide, that can also be connected to sea level rise and coastal flooding. So in the language of climate change, there's a lot of ways that these elements or these aspects touch one another or influence one another, and that's something the team is really looking at closely. But those are all things that we're looking at for the city of Anacortes in terms of how that is related to the changes in precipitation, as well as coastal flooding. Extreme heat events are something that's starting to occur more often in the Pacific Northwest region. And even for Anacortes, even though it's a more northerly climate and not as heat exposed as you might think, this can still lead to some significant impacts for vulnerable populations, particularly on human health. And so we were spending some time looking at where in the city, particularly in areas where there's lots of impervious surface coverage, less trees, less shade, where there may be vulnerable areas, and what are the populations that really tend to live in those areas, and if there are additional risks in that way. And the last piece that we're really looking at is wildfire. And the two aspects of wildfire we're looking at is wildfire smoke. As any of you that live in the region, we all have been impacted by wildfire smoke in recent years. And it is impactful, and it is an impact on human health. And so we're really looking at that broadly across the whole population. And we're also thinking about wildfire. Wildfire in Western Washington occurs less frequently, but that does not mean that there is no risk of wildfire here. And we know, in fact, that Anacortes had a fire in, I believe, 2016 in the Anacortes community forest lands. So we're using this climate element as an opportunity to dig a little bit more into that and understand the challenges that communities may be having, or risks on the ground, so that we can help plan for that in the future. So I know that's a really brief overview and you probably have lots of questions and we have lots more information to share at the boards and later tonight. But we also have developed this tool. It's called the Climate Explorer tool. It's a story map for those who may be familiar with GIS. This is currently online, available on the city's website. And it's a tool that has a lot of the information we're sharing, or all the information we're sharing tonight, as well as even more information about both the impacts from climate change, the results of the greenhouse gas inventory that John Phillips is going to talk about in a moment, as well as what we're talking about climate vulnerability that John is going to introduce in a second. So the tool provides interactive information on local climate impacts. This slide is looking at sea level rise, and you can toggle the different levels of sea level rise and see what's impacted. And you can also look kind of at the block group level, more of a kind of high level look at where areas of the city are more impacted. And the tool also describes how local impacts could affect key assets in Anacortes. And that's really key and integral to how the climate element process is structured. We're really basing it off of what are the key assets that make Anacortes important and valuable to the community, and understanding how those are going to be impacted by climate change. So with that, I'm going to give the mic over to John Phillips, who's going to talk a little bit more about climate vulnerability.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. John Phillips with Parametrics. We've been supporting makers in the city with developing tools to look at the climate element, including both the greenhouse gas inventory, which is on the your right, and then more of the climate vulnerability assessment, which is on your left. Just to give you an idea of what we do when we say climate vulnerability, that's really the impacts from climate change that we've identified and Katie's talked about, but we add in a lot of demographic information. We want to make sure we look at those impacts, even though the pretty steady state across the city of Anacortes. We look at those impacts from the perspective of how they impact people and how they impact your infrastructure, roads, buildings, your waste treatment, all those things that happen within a city, how that impact's going to happen. And the key thing for us to look at is actually the populations within those areas. So we divide it up into basically census blocks using both an exposure, which is the climate impact, and a sensitivity. And a sensitivity is a lot of the human health things. We look for where those larger populations of people with health issues. We also start then look at adaptive capacity, which is demographic information, like income, housing types, age, education level, things like that. So we can get a good sense of how the population in different parts of the city will be impacted by climate change. And in all honesty, it's not that variable, right? We're not saying one area is more impacted than another from these climate impacts, but how we might address those through policies and goals are really important. So we want to make sure we have the information to kind of sort through and say, what are the things that are happening? Katie mentioned like reducing the amount of impervious area, increasing the amount of tree cover, things like that, that are simple ways to address those heat issues. So the index is kind of a score. The higher the number, the more vulnerable, the lower the number, the less vulnerable. But if you'll notice, a lot of these areas that are less vulnerable are areas where lower population density occurs. So we also take a closer look at kind of ground truth, like are there pockets of population within those areas that we have to be concerned about and what's going on there? Why are these scoring where they are? And when you go onto this tool, if you click on a census block, it'll bring up the information that's actually combined down to that score. And you can see how each of those impacts from either the sensitivity, the adaptive capacity, or the climate impact ranks among the entire city. Like, is this number 1 or is this number 10? And don't be ashamed if you're number 10, and don't be ashamed if you're number 1. It's just a way for us to look at the data and understand, like, what do we need to look at within those areas and within those communities. And that helps kind of guide those policies and decisions. We've done a lot of these at different scales, from a city all the way to the state scale, to understand all of that. And as more data comes out, which actually happens, we update the map. So we have that data. So for instance, the American Community Survey of the Census Bureau has just put out a really great data set. We're still trying to figure out what it all means and get it in there, but how many homes they've estimated that have air conditioning. Okay. It's kind of a key, that's kind of a key piece of information when we start talking about heat. So we're going to transition. That's a nice transition from climate vulnerability to greenhouse gas inventory. So switch gears. Now we also did what was called a community greenhouse gas inventory over the course of the spring and the summer. We finished the report earlier this fall. It's available online. There's a one print copy up here. I highly encourage you to read it online. It's easy to read online, and you don't have to print it. And it's actually kind of thick. So our key findings from the greenhouse gas inventory is a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions for City of Anacortes come from your buildings, and that's an energy thing. And what we want to understand is what's being done already to reduce that greenhouse gas emission. In other words, there's things that are happening outside of the city of Anacortes that will reduce that, like different energy companies have to also get to net zero. So as your energy becomes less of a carbon emitter, you're able to use that, and that number will actually reduce. And then what can the city do to look at like how buildings are built within the city? What are the building codes? How can we make more energy efficient buildings? And in all honesty, I know this is an old neighborhood. My home is 120 years old, so I'm not picking on old homes. Old homes are less efficient than new homes. Sorry. But there's ways to make older homes even more efficient as well. So that's one of the things we look at. And obviously, that's something that I care about very deeply. The next thing we looked at is your transportation energy. So that's the fuel that's burned within the city of Anacortes. And unfortunately, it includes the ferry system. Fortunately, the ferry system's trying to decarbonize their ferry system. So going over to electric fleet, you get a little bit of a credit for that. So when they start making use more of the electric fleet for the ferry system, that'll actually reduce the city of Anacortes emissions along with the state's emissions. But we're all in this together. The other things we look at is waste disposal. So that's your solid waste, garbage, things like that. Your wastewater treatment plant. Those are your two waste. That's a very small emissions factor right now. We keep an eye on that. That's something that we want to do is update this every few years to see how things might have changed, what has gone down, what has gone up. And then your industrial processes. And actually that's pretty interesting to see that so low here, given the amount of seafood handling you have, because seafood processors use a lot of refrigerants and things like that. So we took a close look at that, make sure got all the right numbers, but in all honesty, that's pretty low. Now, the big positive, remember the community forest that Katie mentioned, the Anacortes community forest, that is actually sequestering carbon for you. So you get a negative score. That means you're actually reducing the amount of carbon coming from Anacortes. Yay for the community forest, but you guys are still up in the upper thresholds of having a per capita emissions factor. So you're at 13.7 when the rest of the state's at 13.5. The other half of what we look at is your consumption. What are you bringing into the city and using? Whether that's goods, food, fuel, and of course, air travel. And we all hear air travel getting knocked every time you fly. It's a big carbon emitter. So that's all kind of estimated for the community. And you can read a little bit more about how that happens. But it's also a nice way to kind of say, hey, there's some things you can do that might change that. And we did a survey at the last open house to kind of hear a little bit what people are doing. We'd love to hear more about what you're doing since June. If you were here in June and say, hey, I'm going to try to change one thing. I'm going to ride my bike all summer long. That's great. We'd love to hear that. So this fancy graph, we call it our wedge graph. And this is actually accounting for all those emissions I talked. So everything we just talked about, where your emissions are happening and where they're reduced. These are things that are happening already to reduce carbon emissions. You see that yellow line is kind of the target. The different colored lines are all the different emissions I talked to about the last slide. The red line would be where you would be if you did nothing. And if the state did nothing. A lot of these things that are reducing emissions are statewide policies that are reducing fuel source, electricity, things like that, where the state's helping out quite a bit with some of their policies and those. And then we have some kind of actions that the city we think should support. We want to hear from you. We want to hear things that you want to see the city do. We'll also be working with the climate team, as Katie mentioned, to kind of come up with some goals and policies out of some of these actions that can be taken locally to reduce your carbon emissions. And this is kind of a place where we will actually come back then and say, hey, this one takes your emissions down to here over a 25-year period. This will take your emissions down to here over a 25-year period. We used to call that scaling, and that's kind of a next step. And that helps kind of prioritize some of the actions we might hear about tonight and throughout the next few months as we work with the community to figure out how to reduce their carbon emissions. Yay. Thank you. And I'll be right over here answering questions all evening. And I'll hand it off to Marcus.
Thanks, John. All right. So just to give a quick update on the land use, housing, and economic development elements here. So draft land use and housing goals and policies are, we have some copies over at the table over here. They are open to the public. We've done in August and September, we did some presentations to the Planning Commission on the draft goals and policies for both the land use and housing element, along with some the housing action plan concepts as well. So you can go back on the website and find those presentations if you want to review them. And we have some options, or we have some copies over at the table for you to look at as well. Please, you can pick them up You can take them over to your seat if you would like, but please don't take them home with you, so that you can share with everybody else here tonight. Additionally, we have an upcoming public hearing on November 13th. So you'll be able to go on the website, do any public comments, send emails to staff, and also have an opportunity to sit in at the public hearing and give public comment as well. So at the public hearing on November 13th will be, the city will be looking at land use, housing, and transportation draft goals and policies. We also did a presentation about updates to the future land use map. And so this is what we have. Again, we have a board over there on the side to look at, and then just some updates to the future land use map, which is going to be looking at land use changes throughout the city. And many of these are some parcel changes and otherwise some possible zoning changes or land use designation changes. For economic development, the city is working with the Center for Economic and Business Research at Western Washington University. They're going to be helping to develop an economic development strategy plan that will be useful and helpful in also kind of updating the economic development element in the comprehensive plan. There's a survey that's available, now publicly available for you to take if you're interested in the economic development topics. And then there will also be some focus group sessions being planned by Western Washington upcoming in November to participate in. So I believe Jason and Dylan are over here on this side. So they have some business cards, there's some QR codes, board, opportunity to take the survey with the QR code. Today in person on your phone, or you can go on the website and take it there. With that, I'm going to hand it off to the next speaker, Chris, which is going to be on the transportation element updates.
Thank you, Marcus, and good evening, everybody. Thank you, John, for the introduction. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about transportation. I could just push this in advance. Whoops. Wrong way. Okay, so you've probably heard already this evening, there's been quite a few changes in the state legislation. There's been several new transportation requirements for the transportation element of the comprehensive plan. And we're going to go over just a few of those. This is just one example of some of the things that the GMA calls for. And one of the most important things in terms of transportation and land use is the transportation element is supposed to implement the land use element. And so land use is essentially what drives trips, where people want to go, destinations. And so what we're trying to do is create a transportation system that does that, gets people where they want to go, no matter how they want to get there. So it's about sidewalks and bikeways, vehicles, transit, and other modes. And that's what you see here. This is the notion of complete streets. You've probably heard that term, and what it means is, generally speaking, the city should be looking to try to provide space for all different user types. And from a vulnerability standpoint, we want to make sure that people are kept safe and comfortable. So pedestrians are at the top. I want to make sure, especially on busy roads, that there's some dedicated space for them to be walking and kept safe from vehicle traffic. And the same is true with all the other modes as you go down the pyramid. And in the end, of course, you can't have everything on every single road. So it's about balancing these needs. Transportation infrastructure is very, very expensive. And so we have to prioritize. Related to that, there's been a bunch of changes at the RCW level as well regarding the State Department of Transportation. Anytime there's work done on a state highway now that's over $500,000, and that can be a simple traffic signal, they have to look at it through the lens of complete streets, meaning that it's not just a project that is a traffic signal meant for cars. They have to look at the ADA ramps. They have to look at the sidewalks. They have to look at if there's a need for bikeways going through there. And so that's a mandate for them. That's in the state law now. In addition to that, they created an active transportation plan, and that requires them to look at state highways through the same lens. In population centers, they're supposed to be putting sidewalks or pedestrian ways and bikeways on state highways where people are living. Now, that's a big ask, and in rural areas, it's probably going to be very difficult and very long-term. But in cities, it's a really big deal. Here in Anacortes, you have Highway 20 going through town. So the city will probably be able to partner with the state on some of this and try to get some more sidewalks and bikeways on the state highway. Just to illustrate what this looks like, whoops, we don't have that map. This is the map of the city's street system. Highway 20 is in red. So that's where you would see some of this stuff with partnerships with the state. In red, you have the big roads, the state highway in this case. Yellow is minor arterials, some of the major roads, city roads. And then the collector roads, the arterials are in purple. These kind of go from the minor into the neighborhoods, kind of distributes vehicles around. And then you've got your local streets, of course, shown in white. So all of these boards are over here. You can take a closer look and we can answer questions if you'd like. This is what the transit system currently looks like in Anacortes. And this is another important part of what we're doing with the transportation element. State law changed regarding transit. Now we're required to have transit level of service standards in addition to vehicle level of service standards. The same is true for active transportation. And when I say active transportation, it's pedestrian and bicycle essentially, but it also includes transit because many transit trips start as a pedestrian trip. Here's an example of what we're calling the draft. I'm sorry, I'll speak more directly into the microphone. This is an example of what we're calling the draft active transportation system. And there's a map of that right behind John over there. And it's essentially replicating what you saw in the 2016 plan with what was called Anacortes Walks and Bikes. And so we've taken all of that good work and translated it into this. The primary part of the system is in dark blue. The secondary part of the system is in light blue. By secondary, we just mean that they're lower volume streets. They go into the neighborhoods a little bit deeper, get to where people live. So as an example, on some of these light blue colored streets, it might be okay for, say, a bicyclist to be sharing the road with a car because there's low volume and low speed, but you still might need a sidewalk to keep people off of the roadway and have a safe place to walk. In addition to that, we're also including the trails. And in this particular depiction, you see brown, the Tommy Thompson Trail and the Guemes Channel Trail. And it's not the footpaths or recreational trails that we're talking about. We're talking about kind of the major trails that can be used for transportation. So anyway, that map is over here and we'll be happy to answer questions about that as we go. And to finish up, we just wanted to show you what we've been doing for public engagement. We've done quite a few things. We were not here at the transportation folks were not here at the first open house. But there was another open house in late June for the Skagit County comp plan that we're working on. And so we were here for that. We've had an online survey going that was going from the beginning of August until 2 weeks ago at the beginning of October. We got about 445 responses. And there's some cards over at our table. My colleague Jane, raise your hand. She's over there and there's these cards over there. If you want to see the online results, you can go to this QR code and see those results. There's also some handouts on the table. The quick poll that was with the survey is still open. The survey itself is closed. There's also an interactive map that's still open. So you can go drop a pin on the map if you want to tell us where you think some improvements need to be made. And you can do the quick poll as well. So here we are here tonight at the open house. And then as you already heard, there's a public hearing on November 13th. So you've got a couple more opportunities to make some comments and provide feedback. And here's just a quick look at a couple of the questions that came from the survey. And there's more information over here on some of these boards, some of the more interesting questions and responses. But people were saying essentially, they thought that the city trails, the pedestrian crossings, street lights, street connectivity, and bikeways were pretty good qualities of the existing transportation system. And then in terms of improvements that they would like to see, sidewalks, crossings, and trails, roadway maintenance, bicycle facilities, new road connections, and then signals and roundabouts at intersections. So that's what I have to share with you. And I think I'm handing it back to Katie now.
Thanks, Chris. So that mostly concludes our presentation. We just wanted to share a quick overview of upcoming Planning Commission meetings, October 30th for some presentation discussion on items, November 6th, continued discussions if needed. And then as been said multiple times tonight, the public hearing on November 13th. And I'm going to leave this slide up for folks attending online. We're transitioning now into the open house portion of the event. So we invite people to come up, look at the boards, have conversation, and have feedback. I'll leave this slide up because we do have several different digital tools available. The Climate Explorer, as I mentioned, but I neglected to mention there's also a survey attached to that. So the link to the survey is in the Climate Explorer, and it works best if you've kind of looked at the Climate Explorer and then have the chance to kind of look through the various pages and information and then provide feedback. If folks really just want to look at the boards tonight and do a survey, we do have paper copies available. I'm not sure exactly where they are, but we'll make sure they're available here at the table so that folks can take a paper copy tonight if that's their preference. But there's a little more information on the Climate Explorer tool online, so we recommend people do look at that, as well as the economic development survey that's been mentioned, and then just Anacortes website with a host of information. So with that, we'll leave this slide up for folks online, but with that, we're going to transition to the open house, and I really look forward to talking with you all. So thanks so much.